Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is the Bucky Inspired Comprehensivity series that we do in collaboration with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. I am honored to have D.W. Jacobs, Doug, here, and he does this amazing one-act play. He's the playwright, director, and sometimes the actor too for the Buckminster Fuller play. And today he's going to be talking about dramaturgy. So, Doug, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. This is something of a work in progress, and I hope I didn't over-prepare, which might make me freeze up, but it's I do have a presentation which I'll be showing, and there's a lot of material. The odd thing is that just as a backdrop, is I started in science and math, and then was studying at UC Santa Barbara political geography, sociology, political science, economics, anthropology, all kinds of history. And then, but my first English class was in modern theater and in Shakespeare and in Camus, and it sort of really opened up some things questions I'd been asking myself my whole life. And then I fell in love with an actress, and I got into theater, and she escaped theater, I guess. And then I saw Bucky speak soon after spring break, kind of sandwiched between Martin Luther King's assassination and Robert Kennedy's assassination, right in that window there. And the problems were so massive that he reminded me of my Mormon grandfather, actually, in the way he was dressed, and very properly dressed, and very gentle kind of presence. And he was just saying, okay, we can solve all these issues that everybody thinks are too impossible to solve. And I went into his ideas, went out of his ideas, back into his ideas, and suddenly, but I got into theater at the end of my freshman year, took my first acting class, acted in my first play, then began acting in plays every quarter. I was at Santa Barbara, and by my junior year, I declared dramatic art as my major. And it was a very heavy reading program, theoretical, and all of these things. So I'm going to show you, and then strangely, decades later, I wrote a play about Buckminster Fuller, and I met him right when I was doing theater, and I was rowing crew, and Bucky was a rower. I've told this story before, but my brother, I just want to honor my brother a little bit, is he called me up and said, you got to listen to this guy talk. And I said, who is it? Buckminster Fuller, never heard of him. Well, what does he talk about? Well, he talks about everything. And well, I've got class, I'm rowing crew. I was cast in my first play. I had rehearsals at night, and he said, come whenever you can. He talks all day. And so I did go around noon, saw the opening of a speech, went to a class, came back, still talking, went to dinner, came back, still talking, went to a rehearsal, came back about 10 o'clock at night. He was still talking. More people were in the room. The room was packed by the end of the day. Students sitting on the floor, hanging in the windows. It was an old military barracks building, and very, very powerful. And then he did that for 2 weeks straight. He was there at the opening of the College of Creative Studies where my brother was studying painting. So this will dovetail into things. I'll share the screen now if I can find the right one. So the odd thing about theater is it's a lot about the emotions, right? But what theater is really about is action, and I will return to this. And I studied theater for 4 years at Santa Barbara, then 2 years at Cal Arts, and there were two great teachers at Cal Arts who hammered into me the importance of action in theater, and that if an actor is playing an action, which is almost like a vector force, they're really going after something specific, or maybe it's a little amorphous, but somehow unconsciously there's something really driven to achieve a certain end. And if you don't achieve that end, or you do achieve that end, or you think you're approaching that end, or you're not approaching it, then different emotions emerge. And so real actors really root into an action. And if they're and then the emotions are a byproduct. So a lot of times when you're seeing an actor and you may be fascinated by it, maybe he's doing a lot of interesting things, but you're not quite buying what he's doing. It may be that they're rooted in the emotion or consciously or some other action, like they're playing the actor's action, which is to have the audience like them, to be a great actor. And there's a great Romanian teacher I just trained with a few years ago. He passed away this year, and he was amazing. And he would brainwash actors into not acting, into just because the camera picks up everything. Now in the theater, you have to be a little more aggressive with the actions, but you really have to let the emotions come out like the waves in a boat, almost like what Bucky calls a precessional effect. And I'll talk about that more. The interesting thing is that as soon as I began to study Aristotle, and I studied it a lot as an undergraduate, but it wasn't until I worked with this commercial artist who became a storyboard artist, who became a writer, who became one of the great directors out of British directors. Actually, is from Scotland, Alexander McKendrick. And he was a genius director and a genius teacher. He did Sweet Smell of Success and a lot of other things. So I'll come back to that. But dramaturgy is a weird word, and I've shifted the name of this to the synergetic dramaturgy. I was calling it Dymaxian dramaturgy, but I think that's actually a trademarked word. And so dramaturgy is the art of the theater, especially the writing of plays. And dramaturgy actually sort of comes from a root that actually means energy. So how you shape energy in a play, which are the energy of an action, of a desire, and how you shape that. I mean, I actually was looking up the etymology of dramaturgy, and I found out it comes from a word named erg, which comes from energy, and it actually referred to synergetics in the etymology. And I often look up the American Heritage website dictionary, which has really good etymologies. So it's the science which treats of the rules of dramatic composition and representation. Now, there are rules, but there's also, it's a complicated thing. I mean, theater has an undefinable thing that sort of is alive. It's an electric thing. And so here you see drama plus ergon, work. So work, energy. So dramaturgy is the work of drama. How to, yeah, Mark Smith is with the BFI, so I know him. But let's move on. I'm trying to explore the generalized principles at work in the development of comedy and drama. And Aristotle actually says comedy begins with rude improvisations. It's just somebody who comes in and messes you up, like, the class clown or the clown in your family, or somebody who just does stuff that's rude and gets people to laugh and embarrasses some people and entertains other people. But then it moves to solo expressions, and then it moves to choral responses. However, in terms of evolution, there is good reason to believe that music and choral responses preceded language. They have studied a breed of monkeys where they choral sing. They sing in chorus. And if somebody's not participating, then they know something's wrong with that monkey, or he's up to no good, or he's doing something he shouldn't be doing, or, so the choral singing is a way to represent the health of the community. And in the Greek theater, it becomes that very much. The chorus represents the people in various ways, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So it goes from rude improvisations, and even religion sort of begins this way, with the wandering preacher shaman who wanders into a town and people gather in a circle around him and he performs. And then Bucky says the priests ended up taking religion into the temple behind closed doors, and then it became secondhand religion. And Bucky really believed that there should be no secondhand religion, that we're all kind of hot-wired to God, and that we shouldn't hand off that connection to divinity to other powers. But then in the Greek theater, and I'm going to go back and repeat some of this stuff, so don't worry about this. But there are then mimetic depictions of actions and counteractions. The impulse to imitate we have as children. Children sort of imitate other people, and so that imitation is an interesting principle, and we'll come back to that. But all of this is sort of gets aimed at life's wrestling matches with the Greek theater, and a wrestling match is an agon. So agons are wrestling matches, and wrestlers are agonists. That's the Greek word for a wrestler. And so the protagonist, we know that these words we sort of know from maybe studying theater a little bit. There's the protagonist who has an action, and there's an antagonist who wants to stop him. Well, that's wrestler A and wrestler B, basically. And Greek theater is a series of wrestling matches. And then interrupted by choral responses. And we'll get more into the meaning of what the choral responses are. So working on Bucky, I remember reading in a book, I can't even find it anymore, but it seemed audacious in the late 20th century. It was in 1980, and I think it was in one of the books I saw on a remainder table. And Bucky seemed to be asking a question like, in Synergetics, the geometry of thinking. I mean, is there a structure common to both physical and metaphysical reality? Now, in the 20th century, where metaphysics had become old-fashioned and rejected, this is kind of an outrageous statement. And it's also why a lot of scientists are uncomfortable with Bucky, although they may like him because of his creativity, but they're uncomfortable. Sometimes they hate him, but sometimes they like him because he thinks out of the box from the way they do. But is there a structure common to both physical and metaphysical reality? And the Greek theater kind of wrestles with this, the microcosm, what in these groups with CJ came to mean micro-incisive, drilling down to the details, and then stepping back and getting the whole picture. So that's, these ideas, this will all begin to make more sense as I go into the movement principles of how we go into something and how we get out of something. But let's move on for now. The circle. I talk about the shaman or the storyteller or anybody who walks into a village and a circle forms around him. And the circle is like a primary structure, a symbol of the sun often. And there are circle dances, like a Christmas carol comes from a French word carol, which literally means a circle dance. So circle dances have existed throughout all known history. I mean, probably even dancing and I mean, even in lower in different animal forms, there's a way they gather around each other. They sort of circle around the leader. So here's a picture, I think it's Fra Angelico, of a circle dance, right? It looks like it's a Renaissance painting, but going back to the Greek ideal of dancing, okay? So that's one circle dance. Here's a modern Matisse's picture of the dance, which is a circle dance. And there's actually, the circle seems to be broken there, which is interesting. I hadn't noticed that before. I was sort of looking at this, but these two hands in the middle are a little bit apart. And then here, the Mesoamerican picture, which there's a circle dance. And then there's a big figure next to it, which could be a god, could be somebody impersonating a god, could be an animal, could be an animal man, could be a god man. But it's, right now, I'm not trying to explicate what that figure is, but that it's bigger and it plays maybe a dominant role. So you have a circle and then you have the head of which is the chorus, or the group politic, and then you have a leader of the group. And so you have a headman, maybe of a tribe or of a family, or the father or the mother, or the matriarch or the patriarch. So there's the group, and there's a symbol who represents the group. And then here is a picture of Krishna, which is a circle dance. So this is sort of, whether we're talking about India, Mesoamerica, the Greeks, the circle dance is a primary evolutionary gathering. I mean, bees communicate apparently through dance. So this is really built into our biology going back probably long before human beings. So that idea of gathering in a rhythmic pattern, which then music maybe comes out of that, and then maybe poetry comes out of the music, is an interesting idea. So here you have a figure who goes to the center of the circle. Now the chorus man may go to the center of the circle. He may linger on the edge of the circle. He may disappear into the circle if it's a less authoritarian group, or he may move to the center of the circle, or they may invite somebody to move to the center of the circle because they're a funny storyteller, or they sing better than other people too. And so a Christmas carol actually has a soloist, and then it has a chorus who sort of expresses some emotional weight to the song. And then the soloist tells the story of the song and the variations of the song. And then the chorus kind of joins in and mostly reinforces the power of the song. So then you have a figure in Greek history that's called Thespis. And he's the first known actor. I'm sure there were other actors, but he gets the credit. And so actors are called thespians, which I don't particularly like the word, but Thespis is there. And he's at the center of the circle. And then the chorus member is still in the circle. So the chorus leader is still representing the group or the village or the society or the city. And so he's the spokesman of the city. And apparently Thespis would do dialogues with the head of the chorus. Now the chorus initially was 50 men, and then maybe 50 men and 50 boys, and then it was maybe 12 men, and then it was maybe 15 men, and different playwrights sort of added and shrank the chorus, but the chorus sort of grew and shrunk. But here, you have an orbital routine where one planet is going around another planet. Oddly, the number of dots there is about 50. So that's about the size of the initial Greek chorus. We're about 50 people, then an actor in the middle, having scenes with an actor in the circle that represented the group. Okay, then it gets interesting. Then Aeschylus adds a second actor, and he's the first great Greek playwright, and he kind of defined, in a way, the ritualization of law into a practice where all chaos was about to break loose, but they agree to go to court and they establish a legal process. But they're basically two actors. There's still the chorus, and then there's still the head of the chorus. So you have basically, here you have like one marshmallow here. And Amy Edmondson taught me this marshmallow toothpick thing. Then you have a dyad, you have two marshmallows and a stick, okay? So that's in a sense what Aeschylus has. It's a dialogue between two characters. Now, the interesting thing is that testimony is a really important thing in courts. It's a really important thing in churches. It's a really important thing in life where people share the truth. Now, testimony actually comes from a word that means testes or testicles, but it also comes from a word that means three. And so the testimony was witnessing, and the witness was the third person. In this structure, there's a witness, the chorus witnesses this, but it's a third element witnessing an argument. So to make it something more than a he said, she said, he said, she said, sort of argument, then you need a witness to try to sort this out. But then you kind of need, Sophocles adds third actor. Now in physical reality, a triangle is very solid. In human reality, a triangle gets very messy, gets very unstable. And so I was actually working with, he was living with us, the artistic director of the experimental theater in San Diego, Sledgehammer Theater, was living with us, and I was running San Diego Rep. And late at night, we would watch talk shows because that's all the TV had late at night. So we were watching Jerry Springer and other talk shows late at night, these horrible talk shows, right? And we realized the structure of a talk show was exactly the same as a Greek tragedy. And we ended up doing an adaptation of the Oedipus trilogy as Oedipus as TV talk show, like Oedipus coming out to give a speech on the plague, you know, like Clinton coming out for a video town meeting. It was a video town meeting. There was the head of the chorus. So Jerry Springer, or the host of a talk show, is the head of the chorus. The audience is the chorus. And one person comes out and tells the story. Then a second person comes out and tells a counter story. You've been cheating on me. No, I haven't. You've been cheating on me. No, I haven't. And then the third person, then the person who's been cheating with that other person shows up on stage and all hell breaks loose. And never does a fourth person, occasionally a fourth person comes out, but they only repeat what one of the other three people says. They just take sides. They don't have a distinct position. So as soon as you get the three actors and you get the head of the chorus, you suddenly have a tetrahedron. And it's very similar to what Bucky said about Goldilocks and the three bears. Goldilocks is looking at the three bears, which are Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, and Cassiopeia. And Bucky taught his daughter when she was sick, all this sort of cosmogony and relativity through the story of Goldilocks and the three bears. So this fairy tale structure is at the root of Greek theater. It's at the root of you know, you've got somebody is accused of a crime, and you have somebody who's accusing them, and you have somebody who's defending him, and then you have a judge who's listening to it, then you have a jury who's listening to that. So you've got the chorus, the judge, the two attorneys, and the person who's accused of a crime. So then here we have Tetraskull, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, which is a cosmic fairy tale, and Bucky is loved fairy tales and myths and poetry and different things, and musical comedy songs, which he'd rewrite to his own purpose, or British music hall songs. He loved Ray Bolger songs, and he'd rewrite them. So here's Goldilocks. You can see her on the beach, looking at the three bears, Cassiopeia, Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, and then that replicates a tetrahedron. So in a way, once you have the third actor, you have a tetrahedron going from the head of the chorus to the three actors, and then the whole chorus kind of resonates with the struggle of the three actors. Okay. So there on a beach, she's looking at these things, and that replicates the tetrahedron. Here's the Greek theater. Now, this is after a lot of development. The first Greek theater was probably in a hill, a cup in a hill, and the audience went up on the hillside so they could see the dancers better, and the dancers went down at the bottom of the hill, and they performed, and then the actors performed. And then the skene, which sort of looks a lot like scene, is sort of like the set, but that actually means tent. That word skene is a tent. So the first theater might have been a tent in a meadow with a hill surrounding it, so the audience could sit on the hill. And at Santa Barbara, we had a teacher who would get us out at dawn, take us to the sea cliffs near the ocean, and we would perform Greek monologues while the audience would sit on the hillside, and the guy was at the bottom of the hill. So we actually did that at UC Santa Barbara. So, but the theater got very big so that the whole city could come there. And the theater played an important life in the city, where not just the wealthy went to theater, but the poor, the slaves, various people would go to the theater. And the Roman theater was probably even more oriented to the people. But here you have ramps that come up to the stage. So where it says proscenium, that's where the actors ended up, on a raised platform behind the chorus, which performed in the orchestra, which actually refers to a dancing place. The original meaning of the word orchestra is a dancing place. There's possibly an altar to Dionysus at the center of the circle. And there are certain movements towards and away the altar, or to the right and to the left, which are often called strophes and antistrophes. So the movement in one direction and the other direction are there. So here's what the Greek theater developed in, and it happened very quickly. I mean, somewhere around between 400, 500 BC, the Greek theater, the golden age of the Greek theater, came in, and then the theaters were replicated all over. You'll find them in Turkey, you'll find them in Rome, you'll find them everywhere. In Rome, they tended to cut out the orchestra or make it very small, and so all of the play happened on the stage. And that's more like the theaters we have today, although frequently you'll have thrust stages where the actors go out in the middle of the audience. So here's Aristotle's Poetics. And their notes, it's not actually a book. A lot of his books are books, but these are apparently like notes he made for a class, and he was studying the theater and he was trying to describe what was happening. They weren't prescriptions for the theater, but they were common things he saw the plays did. And he said, poetics is a theory of making things, and a poem is a made thing. A story is a made thing. A history is a made thing. And I was actually going into the study. I happened to be reading, the first time I met Allegra in her home with the actor, I think, I was reading about the Egyptian god Thoth, who is the god of invention. And he not is just the invention of physical inventions like pots, pans, or compasses, or this or that, but a poem is an invention. A story is an invention. Thoth is the god of storytelling. He's the god of history. He's the god of all these things. And so I went to Allegra, getting back to the title of the play, The History and Mystery of the Universe. And I said, well, if Bucky is telling a story like Thoth, and if he's kind of the inventor, and he's a poet, and he was recognized as a poet, and he was a writer and a speaker, then what's the story that he's telling? Is it the history of the universe? And Allegra, without a beat, said the history and mystery of the universe. And so you have the sort of logical side, and then you have the irrational side. And as a dancer, she was very aware that the body knows things that the brain doesn't know. And Bucky said Allegra taught him how to move and how to perform almost like a dancer when he lectured, and to be more expressive when he lectured. So that the history and mystery, the two sides, the going to the right brain, going to the left brain, going to the right side of the stage, going to the left side of the stage, going to the center where the altar is, going out away from the center. So Aristotle also said, the arts are an imitation of a range of different things, but tragedy is the imitation of an action. And to really come to terms with what an action is, I had two teachers in graduate school who hammered it into me, and after 6 months, I finally realized, oh, that's what an action is. It's a live thing. It's not a noun. It's not a character. It's not a big, powerful, strong man. It's not the king. It's the guy who either fixes something or he avoids fixing something. He goes to the truth to try to make things better, or he runs from the truth to preserve his own power. And there are different Greek figures who sacrifice themselves for the good of the community, like Oedipus, or Creon, his brother-in-law, who sacrifices everybody else to preserve his own power. Now, he seems like a very good man, but it's what he does. You learn about a character by what they do, not what they appear to be. So this is where Bucky's very interesting when he says, I'm a verb, I'm an action. And so every actor is taught to try to analyze his character in terms of an action. What's your action in this scene? What are you trying to do? Now, one of the best examples, I went to school actually with Ed Harris, and we had a teacher who just hammered this into us. So if you watch Ed Harris act, he plays an action relentlessly. And depending on whether he is succeeding or not, then a certain emotion may come out of that. There's a point where in that movie, The Abyss, where his wife is dead and he's giving her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, trying to bring her back alive. It's not a great movie, but that scene is terrifying because he's so ferociously committed to bringing this woman back to life. And his emotions are all a byproduct of whether he thinks he's saving her life or he's not saving her life. And it's a ferocious example. The other example, I think, is in Apollo 13, when the people in the room, it still raises hair on my head to think about what he did with that moment as an actor. But the room starts to debate on whether they can bring them back or not. And Ed Harris's character very powerfully says, "We're bringing them back." He just states that action. And the whole room wakes up, and they're not speculating anymore. They're out to solve a problem, and they succeed. And I saw that scene decades ago, but the thing lives with me because of the ferocity with the way Ed Harris can play an action. It can be very calm. He doesn't shout when he says that, but it's an absolute action that the room knows they have to serve. So that's what the Greeks, and the action is a movement of spirit, usually from inside to outside, but it can be like a deus ex machina, a god who comes down and slaps everybody around and says, "You're being silly, straighten up, do something, do something better." So the thing is, now this is interesting because the Gita starts with this. It starts with actors, soldiers, on a battlefield. They're going to go into action, they're going to go into battle, and they're on a field of action. They're on a particular field, a battlefield, which is a field of action. So in every area of our life, I just watched Living, which is an adaptation of a Kurosawa movie, which is really good about this, where action becomes some people from the community come with a park they want made, and all the bureaucrats are avoiding doing anything about it. And the whole movie is sort of about that call to an action and whether anybody's going to respond to it or not. It's a very simple thing. It's a very powerful movie. Now, Brecht, who is sort of anti-Aristotelian in a lot of ways, he brought epic structure to theater, whereas for good or bad, Aristotle brought beginning and middle end to theater. And everybody sort of does a play like a beginning, middle, and end. But the trick that he never really shared, but because he knew it and we don't, is that the end of every classical play is the beginning of the next classical play. It never ends. It's like somebody dies, but then somebody else has to pick up that curse or that blessing or that obligation, and it goes on. So Bertolt Brecht, who was sort of bringing epic structure back into the theater, said we need a type of theater which not only releases the feeling, insights, and impulses possible within the particular historical field of human relations in which the action takes place, but employs and encourages those thoughts and feelings which help transform the field itself. And I think this is the heart of a lot of the problems in America today, is that we've lost a lot of the wisdom of the playing field. What is a good game? What is a fair game? What is a level playing field? What is a field where actions can take place that might lead to a productive conclusion, and will end with people going, my dad loved to coach church basketball, and we would lose a game and he'd be so happy. And I go, "Why are you happy? We lost." He said, "That's the best game you ever played." And he would be just delighted at the skill that we brought to the game, even if we lost. Now that is really in danger, I think, in America right now. What is the level playing field? And are there any rules to the game that can't be twisted or tweaked? Now, Kenneth Berg, this is really important in terms of the purpose, the action. You have a purpose, then you have an obstacle. Like Oedipus is trying to get the spiritual teacher Tiresias to agree with him. Tiresias is trying to get Oedipus to see the truth. They come to a total stalemate. And it's a ferocious outburst of passion because the goal is not being reached by either one of them. And they start shouting each other in almost one-line exchanges that are almost like rap insults. It's just bang, 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 bang. It's called stichomythia. It's just one-line insults. And then Oedipus runs off stage. He gets in such a passion, he has to run off stage. Then the chorus comes in, and they do one of two things. They talk about the problem and how the problem of the hero is going to affect their lives, or they talk in poetry about the emotion. They talk about floods and storms and lightning. And Euripides is really good at this. Sophocles has his chorus, and Aeschylus, they talk about the political issue or the problem, what's really going on here. And Euripides, with his plays, the choruses are more a poetic expression of the emotion through metaphor and storms and nature. And I think we saw that in Mary Shelley, the importance of nature reflecting the passion of the action. Then the character comes back on stage. Oedipus comes back on stage, and he's burned through the passion. He's calm again. He has a new perception about what might be going on and a new purpose. And then the cycle repeats. And this is a really important thing in drama, that there's a purpose, there's a frustration, there's an exhaustion. And once you're exhausted, then you might wake up and go, oh, this is different than I thought. I have a new idea about this. And so you work on that new idea. It's part of the trial and error process and the mystique that CJ used to talk about. The other thing about an actor, and some acting teachers define this way, you're attracted to something, you're repulsed by something, or you're neutral. And a lot of actors they take for granted this neutrality, the stillness, where a character may be trying to figure out what's going on. Shakespeare does this a lot, where people scream through whole speeches, but many of his monologues, a character's trying to figure out what's going on and is really talking to himself in a monologue that's almost like an argument with himself, trying to figure out what to do. And then at the end, he figures it out, and then he has a huge rush of emotion at the end of the speech, and he moves in a new direction. We played for 500 Hamlet for 500 high school kids once, and they started to react to the play like it was a rock concert. I mean, and the guy playing Hamlet was first afraid of the students, but then he began to ride them like a surfer. So when he said, "Who calls me coward?" 2 or 3 kids in the audience said, "I do, I do, I do." And they all shouted and were like, they were talking back to him the way the groundlings did in the Elizabethan theater. And he began to ride their reactions. So at the end of another monologue, when he said, "My thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth," the kids in the high school audience exploded in cheers. They just exploded in cheers. And at the end of the play, when he killed Claudius, they roared, they loved it. But that Shakespeare did write for the audience to explode in reaction. But that stillness, where you don't know what somebody's going to do. I think it happens in the Scottish play when somebody comes and tells Macduff that his wife and children have been killed, and he just stops. He just doesn't respond, and they're almost begging him to react in some way. And he's going to explode into action or into emotion or something, but there is that stillness that holds the ramification, the silence, which holds the power of theater. And dancers will say it's not the strength of the movement that counts, it's the strength of how a movement stops that counts. When it stops, you know how powerful the movement was. So here's the emotional reaction of the Greek masks. And this is kind of interesting because I may stop soon after this and then we'll come back to it. But here are a series of emotional reactions. And there's a comedy mask to the right and a tragedy mask to the left. And apparently, I just realized this, I didn't know this before, these were set on the altar of Dionysus at the end of the play. They would take the masks off and they would set them. And Dionysus was really Apollo was the god of reason, Dionysus was the god of night and of winter, and Apollo of summer and of the mind. And the oracle at Delphi, actually, depending on whether it was the winter months or the summer months, was a worshiping place for both Dionysus and Apollo, the rational and the irrational, the history and the mystery, you know. So here, this is interesting to me. I have mixed feelings about these masks because they're kind of a cliche, but then I think at some point when I was working on, in the 1980s, and I was working on Shakespeare and I was reading a lot of the Bhagavad Gita, people talk about this, okay, the theater is about laughter and it's about crying, but they never talk about the stillness, that silence, the quiet, the place between these two masks. And so here's that famous section. It was a famous section from the Bhagavad Gita from Gandhi. Gandhi actually loved this section. I think he had it memorized and recited it. But it's the one about how do you know a man who is firmly established and absorbed in Brahman? I mean, what are his characteristics? I'll just read about 4 verses. And look at these masks and think about them. He knows bliss in the Atman and wants nothing else. Cravings torment the heart. He renounces cravings. I call him illumined. Not shaken by adversity, not hankering after happiness, free from fear, free from anger, free from the things of desire. I call him austere and illumined. The bonds of his flesh are broken. He is lucky and does not rejoice. He is unlucky and does not weep. I call him illumined. The tortoise can draw on its legs. The seer can draw on his senses. I call him illumined. So if at the end of the Greek theater, they took these masks off and put them on the altar to Dionysus, then as Aristotle says, the theater really was a purgation of pity and fear. It really was a way, a method to get to equanimity. And one of the most common phrases in the Greek tragedy is count no man happy until they're dead. You know, as long as you're alive, you'll be going through these smiles and these grimaces. And but then you have to try to find that space, that open space that was a major theme in a number of the different groups that we've been talking about. So I think I'll stop there now and see if there are questions. We'll get onto it, but drama, conflicting loyalties to self, family, tribe, group, the beloved, the gods, they're all demanding different things. And the Greek plays are about these different demands. And those lead to stresses and conflicts that lead to the shaping of ritual sacrifices to try to reconcile it, stories of transformation. I had an anthropologist, a guy who taught Shakespeare at Santa Barbara. I had 2 different great Shakespeare teachers. One of them said that Shakespeare is an attempt to reconcile the old hero and the new hero. The new hero is Machiavellian. You never know what he really thinks. He may act like your friend, but he may stab you in your back. The old hero has dinner with his enemy the night before in a tent, and then they go out on the field of honor and they fight as known enemies. But in the Renaissance, it was all about you never really knew who your friends were. You never knew who your enemies were. And that may be very important in certain situations, like Othello and Iago. It is a lesson, and it's not good enough to be good. You also have to be smart. You have to be clever as a snake to be gentle as a dove. That is sort of what Othello teaches us, because Iago is sort of like a satanic figure who just messes with people for the fun of it. And but he acts like your best friend. And Shakespeare, I don't know that since Shakespeare's time, we've reconciled these 2 different heroes, you know, the football hero versus, you know, the hedge fund hero who can like destroy lives to make profit. So I think that's enough. I'll leave this up because I think it's one of my favorite quotes from you, Connor, about Bucky. I could make Fuller's talk seem systematic. I could also make it look like a string of platitudes, or like a set of notions never entertained before, or like a delirium. I won't do any of those things. It's a poet's job he does, clarifying the world.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Doug. So shall we take some comments and questions and then we can
Sure.
continue? This is, you have more slides after this, right?
I do. I have.
Okay. Okay. So folks, go ahead. This is a time for brief comments and questions. And what we will do is that after Doug is done with the full presentation, you can add more. I just want to point out one thing here. I have, given that you talked about Gita and that quotation, actually, that state of being is called sthita prajna. Sthita means steady, in place, unmovable. And prajna is wisdom. So it is steady wisdom. So you have all kinds of things flowing through you, but you are steady. So it's a beautiful, beautiful word in the chapter 2 of Gita. So thank you so much. Folks, go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to make brief comments or ask questions. We're going to start with Richard, followed by Evanique. Richard.
Yes, thank you, Doug. This is fascinating. My question, though, goes back to what you said a little bit earlier about the triangle being very stable in the physical sense, but in a human sense, it's very messy. And I wonder if you could sort of elaborate on that a little bit, because I've been working in the human relation side and see triangulation as an effort to stabilize. And sometimes, though, when two go against one, it turns into a striangulation as opposed to a triangulation. So I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on this idea of a messy triangle in terms of human relations.
Well, there's a playwright called Wendy Hammond who wrote a play about I can't remember the name of it, but it's a riff on Kafka's Metamorphosis. And there's a family, a father, a mother, and a daughter. And they kind of take turns around the dinner table, turning each one into a cockroach. It's like mom and dad gang forces and turn the daughter into a cockroach. Mm-hmm. And then the daughter and the mother turn dad into a cockroach. Then dad and the daughter turn the mother into a cockroach. And they just rotate around it, ganging up. Now, if there's real trust in an ensemble, you can get solidity. I mean, you can have a very large ensemble of actors and do really good work. And it doesn't mean they all have to like each other, but there has to be a network of actors liking each other enough to hold the whole ensemble together. And otherwise, I think, the way I was taught triangulation is the negative side of it in human affairs. When you have a problem with your boss, but you go and tell his secretary, right. And rather than go to the boss, or you, and that's fine to go to a third person to sort of dress rehearse your problem. But if you don't go to the main person you have the problem with, you weaken the whole relationship of all three people. Because then suddenly the boss is mad at the secretary listening to my nonsense complaining about him. And suddenly everybody hates each other, because the triangulation is not building trust. It's like the kid going to, now there are good things about that. The kid going to mommy for certain things, daddy for other things, or grandpa and grandma for something else altogether, and does an end run around the parents, and then they come down on them. But it takes a lot of skill and a lot of listening and a lot of mercy and forgiveness in human behaviors to build something stable. But I'll tell you, when a company of actors trusts a director, it's amazing what can be accomplished. And if the director is not abusing the power, or if, I don't know, that's...
yeah, well, it's interesting because...
I mean, the Oedipal triangle, the menage a trois, I mean, it's a classic kind of example. Yeah.
On the positive side, the triangulation of using a talking stick, or the triangulation of a doll in a child abuse, if you want, type of situation, becomes a very important triangulating of the dialogue, so that you're not always sort of head to head, and you can talk through the talking stick, so to speak, and then come back and deal with it directly. Yeah.
I would
Yeah,
agree with that
thank you.
completely. You can get an honest triangulation of a problem and see it from all sides, then that's better. That's healthier than one person winning, or
Good.
two people winning.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Evanique, Robert, Joe, and David. Evanique.
Yeah, thank you, Doug, for a fascinating presentation. So my first thought was when you were talking about the hero and the villain, and you were also talking about a person being very cunning. And it was done in a beautiful and positive way, which I thought is that the person has to be aware that there are bad actors and that they have to kind of know what's coming, but they don't have to become that person. That's my interpretation of it. That they don't have to become that person, but in order for them to be gentle and to be, calm about it, they have to know what's coming. So it's kind of like a strategy of knowing what's coming, but yet you may not be able to do anything about it, but it's okay. You can plan on what you're going to do, right? So I thought that was brilliant. And then I was thinking when you were talking about just now the triangle, and you were talking about the boss and the secretary, and the person going to the secretary, and then the secretary going to the boss, and how that creates a triangle of distrust. And I think about how many times in life, and I think with acting and theater, like it's all a reflection of what's going on in real life, I think. It's more dramatized, obviously, but if you look at theater, it is what goes on in real life, and you can see for yourself, like in real time, like what happens when you try to be cunning, like when you try to undercut someone, um, or you try to go around the issue rather than going straight
Right.
into the issue. And I think that acting really points that out, because you see it full out from beginning to end. And like you said before, it's not really an end, it's just another person has to take up that blessing or curse. It's always another part of the story. But I thought that was brilliant. And then finally, when you were talking about the legal system, and I never thought about it, but if you think about the figures that we have for the justice system, they're Roman and Greek, and the weighing of the scales and justice being blind. Um, but if you think about it, lawyers go up there to act to either they're presenting facts, and we always say, at least in the United States, that the justice system is a trier of fact, which in a sense it is. But what people forget is that it's also that emotion. Those lawyers have to go up there and act, because they have to get the emotion out of you, especially for a defendant that knows their client is guilty, and they know they have to perform the best act to get you to see either the why they're doing it, or why the facts aren't as they seem to be. Like, yes, there's the fact there, but how do you know it was this person? How do you know, like, to create that reasonable doubt? And the prosecutor has to get you angry and make you think that you're in danger. And I'm just thinking of criminal law. So I think of that and I'm like, yeah, that is acting in its finest. And I guess you're right. Like that, the theater also created the legal system that we have. And one interesting thing to note, when I was in college, I took a couple of theater classes, and our theater teacher used to always say that, you need to take drama courses for advertising, for law, and for business, because all of those things you have to drive the emotion. And the one last thing about the hero and villain concept, you were talking about um the football hero and uh the hedge or Wall Street hedge fund. I think they both have those qualities in them, in that the whole football hero, think about why he's the hero. He's usually a small town guy or a guy of modest means, and he comes and he's this big hero. The best example I can think of is the Super Bowl, because I'm from Philadelphia. Sorry, Jalen Hurts, but he's the big hero of the city, no matter win or lose. we love this guy. And it's not because of football. It's like a lot of people said, it's not because of football. It's because of who he is. He is that person. He has to go out there and be very aggressive on that field. But yet he cares about people. And that hedge fund, he has to be very aggressive. But you don't know, that could be the biggest philanthropist that you know. He could have a good heart too. But it's all about, I think, image and what is portrayed out there. And it's all acting. So thank you so much for so many insights.
You're welcome. Thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you, Evanik. Next up is going to be Robert, Joe, David, and Madeline. Robert.
This is fantastic. Evanik got me off in another world there. I'll have to come back to my question, but I'm going to ask this in the context of comprehensivity. And that is, no, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to do this instead. Sorry. I told you she got me out there in the never land. When we do a cohort, we try to create dialogue. And to avoid the issue with the triangle, we appoint someone as a court jester. And person can be a real opposition, dark side person that you have to live with because somebody told you you got to live with this guy. But we give them that honor of being the court jester, which allows them to say anything any way they wish and not be held accountable for it. And I wonder if you could say something about the evolution of the court jester out of, I don't know, did it begin with the Greeks and the Romans, or did it come later?
Well, I think it sort of came with those rude improvisations. You know, the guy who wandered into town and made fun of everybody and made some people laugh and some people want to kill him, you know, and in fact, the court jesters in some courts really risk their lives to sort of tell the truth, and often were beheaded for their wisdom, their foolish wisdom. But there are those traditions, they go back to the Romans particularly. I mean, the Greeks also had this, but the Romans really, the Saturnalia, where the fools they could run wild. Even in the medieval churches, you know, the monks could go crazy and like flout the authority of their priests and bishops and all of that stuff. There is that feast of fools. There is that sort of day each year where all the rules go out the window. That's not a Protestant thing. Protestants don't deal well with fools, you know. I'm not sure they absorb the tradition, but I mean, they get to the humor in other ways. But yeah, it's, I think it is that guy who walks into your village and, well, do we kill this guy or do we honor him? And is he bringing us something that's important or something that'll destroy us? And Oedipus actually is a story about not being xenophobic like Thebes, and it's why he ends up in Athens and he gives his bones to Athens, because Athens is inclusive of the stranger. But the fool, yes, oh, that's a whole nother 2-hour probably lecture about the fool.
Well,
but the fool in Lear, in King Lear, the fool is very, very interesting.
yeah,
And the fool keeps saying, "You're the fool now. I'm the wise man. You're the idiot," and he taunts him relentlessly, and Lear has to admit he's right by the end. I mean, he loses his mind in a way before he can fully absorb his failures in that play, but then he goes to sleep and then he wakes up with some lucidity and gentleness with his daughter finally, and then they both die, you know, terribly. So it's the fool is a very important figure in the Sufi courts. It's very important. And
yeah, I would like to take umbrage with calling him a fool, though. If you've got this individual who's definitely not a fool and has a purpose and intention that doesn't come from the king or from the court, he's got his own motives, but they can oftentimes be very valuable. And if we use that's why we call him the court jester. Because if you did say you're the fool and you can get away with anything you say, that puts a negative context on it, which
Oh, I
we
don't
try
mean
to
it as
avoid,
negative.
you know.
I mean it in the sort of sacred fool tradition that
Right, yeah,
that the fool has a really sacred purpose. He does triangulate. He makes people look at things they don't want to look at.
that's right.
Sort of their shadow side, bringing that out.
Yeah, I particularly like the role of the clowns in circuses because they have to be more able to do everything everybody else does and appear to be clumsy while doing it and still do them. So it's very interesting.
Well, clown's a good idea too. The problem is the fool has a context with it and the clown has a context with it. And this person may not be funny at all. She may not be clumsy.
Right.
Might be very intentional, but also might have some very valuable contributions to make to the cohort. And if you get rid of those people, you lose that input, as negative as it might be and important as it might be. You don't have it to operate with. The point being, as a jester, you don't have to call them out for what they're saying, you know, if they're using foul language or whatever it might be. The group understands that that's that person's role. And it's okay. It's not meant personally. And of course, all the rules with dialogue, you're trying to keep peace, but there's always that person or persons that are not interested in keeping peace. But if you give them an official stance, then they take a little bit different approach.
Well, clowns and fools are very interesting because in the clowning tradition, there is what's called the white clown, which is an authority figure, and he's a bully and he's dangerous. And Fellini uses this in ways that even in some Italian movie people, that Mussolini was like a white clown. He was like a fool, but he's just mean. And then the fool undermines that and is more innocent, and it's a very interesting distinction in clowning. You know, even Laurel and Hardy, you know, Oliver Hardy's kind of the white clown. He's officious and he knows what's right, and Stan Laurel is sort of the fool who doesn't know a thing but turns out to be wiser than the white clown, so to speak. So you see there's the power clown who will beat up an audience to get them to laugh. And there's the fool, like Bucky would say something and the crowd would laugh and he'd look at him like, what are you laughing at? Why are you laughing? And he couldn't figure it out what they were laughing at. And he just hit the truth so solidly that they laughed. But he didn't even know what they were laughing at half the time.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, David, and Madeline. And then we'll continue with the presentation. Joe.
Yeah, this is kind of a almost yes/no question, and actually just working it out myself here and thinking about it. I think the answer is no, but I just want to make sure. The Kenneth Burke tragic rhythm, is there a relationship between that and precession?
Yes, I mean, I think all of this and the mystique that you're going after something and you're misguided and
You end up with a
well,
new
it's funny, that's sort of that's the next thing that we'll talk about, is the principles of movement, and we'll get into precession a little bit.
because I was thinking about the new purpose may be something that would be.
Yes, or that the way you're going at the problem isn't going to work.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And mostly we don't go comprehensively enough. We solve one problem and ignore the 5 problems we're creating to solve the one problem, which is usually to make money, you know.
Right.
We'll sell carbon credits, but that doesn't deal with the ecological delicacy of what's going on. It's just taking one measure, solving that. And some people make money off of selling carbon credits, but it doesn't really solve the larger ecological balance issues. It doesn't deal with the complexity.
Thank you. Next up is going to be David, and then we will continue with the presentation. David, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, a lot of things bobbling around in my mind. So how to talk about this. In drama, we have implicitly there's an audience somehow participating at some level, to some degree, personally in the action, vicariously, but in some way, their role is what the dramatist is trying to help them to find. And there's a learning, or something's happening. They're not sitting still. Some act, they're going to go through something. So the easy way to propose that to a listener, an audience, is a dialectic, is an opposition. So you talked about one thing, which is where the dissonance is represented by a character who comes in, the fool, typical, great example, who contains the unseen for the protagonist, something the protagonist hasn't realized they're encountering, and yet they're encountering. I mean, it's not yet real for that protagonist, and the audience has to tolerate this not seeing while this process is going on, that, there's this blindness that hasn't been worked out yet. And what you don't know is dangerous, which is kind of the opposite of the table you can see. It's the thing you didn't see is really dangerous. So I'm trying to look at the geometry of this. You were talking about, I see an opposition making sense, and how the triangle or tetrahedron, we sort of have poles. An assumption is there's really only one thespian. The action and the unseen is acting with that as the focal point. And it's important, though, that poles aren't really in life, so if we're imitating life, aren't really still and stable, but are alive and can move around and can develop. So if there are two characters in opposition, they have to kind of merge in some way, or maybe both develop, not just the thespian, but do both sides get to develop? And you did talk about the fool kind of exchanging place with the king. I guess that's sort of what I'm looking at. But they both moving essentially is their identities are changing. So they're really alive. They're really growing to something different by the time you see the thing play out. So one of the first question was about poles that actually move, not just clear oppositions. And so is there something that can become, what you see in dramas, where there's more than a two-way struggle, something more complex, kind of reality where you might only be able to solve it by creating a community which has a more complicated shape than true or false, right or wrong, not a strictly logical option, but something different. So can you do a non-two-way drama struggle? What is that? And I'm thinking, a group that becomes a bicycle is something different from just winning a war, or even at the level of a war, overcoming not one enemy, but a balance between two, or something like that. Are there other cases of non-polar, non-logical oppositions that play out as alive, where things move around more complex ways?
Yeah, I found myself thinking a lot about that in the early years I was in theater. And I think Camus, and his definition of tragedy, is that it's two rights that are in conflict. It's not like right and wrong. Real tragedy is about two important values that are in collision. So, in theater, it's a lot like vector analysis in a way. There's a character who's heading this direction, right? And there's another character who's heading, that direction, right? So and that's what they're aiming for, like at the corner of my screens, right? But they intersect in the middle, and they end up here. They end up, because of the way they collide, they don't end up here in one corner up here, and they don't end up here in that corner. They end up here because of the combined forces. And the audience often knows.
Yeah, I like your Zoom graphic. That's the first time I've ever seen the screen used that way.
Yeah, no, I've been trying to explore how the screen can be used in a Zoom meeting, but it is, in vector analysis, if actors are really playing actions, and if they're really listening to each other, they'll both end up somewhere neither the director or the playwright completely anticipated. They are alive. They're not two tape recorders synced up playing in sync. They're alive. That's why I don't like sometimes the over-recording, over-amplification that we get in theaters, because it destroys that fabric of the live interaction. between, it's a little bit why I'm going into this lecture room approach to Bucky, where it's sort of Bucky unplugged, so to speak. It's like one of those LPs where we're not using the electronics, we're just walking into a room and doing it. But that idea of the other thing that you talked about in theater, and I think Aristotle wrote about this, or people have written about it for centuries, dramatic irony is what the audience knows that neither character knows. That's dramatic irony. The audience knows something. And I'll tell you, working class audiences smell this better than educated audiences. You give them a Shakespeare play or a Greek play, in the first scene, they can smell blood. They can smell that somebody's going to screw over somebody else. They can smell. So out of one random phrase, a working class audience will groan in a way that an educated audience is still trying to figure out the language. I mean, they can actually smell it, and kids can. I had one actor, I said, watch Shakespeare, write a sonnet. I give that to actors sometimes to write a sonnet. And so he with his girlfriend was watching Midsummer Night's Dream with her 4-year-old daughter. And they were both completely confused by the story. And the daughter said, well, there's a flower and it makes people fall in love. And she describes the whole plot to them, whereas the adults were too smart to figure it out. I mean, children mainline Shakespeare in a way adults are trying to cogitate it. They approach it with the brain, and kids hear the music. I've heard audiences laugh at a joke, and I know they don't understand the language, but the music of the line is funny. What Shakespeare has written is funny. The rhythm's funny. So it's a mystery.
What you're saying is the content isn't strictly the logos, the word stuff.
No,
The language
there's
part, yeah, right.
There's that there's the shadow or the fool or the clown or what I like what Robert said, that this person who's given, what's the word you used for the jester is a good thing. Yeah, and jest, the word jest is one Brecht uses a lot, the sort of stance, what your stance is to something. It was very important for Brecht, the gestus, the gesture.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, Doug, shall we continue?
Sure. I mean, we've covered a lot of it, but the most important thing takes some time, so it's good we've had a break. Am I sharing? Can you see it?
Yes. You need to start the PowerPoint. Yes, perfect.
All right. So now we're into Bucky Fuller's 6 Principles of Movement. And these are really fascinating. And I've, as a director, as an actor, and just looking at how events happen around us, even in terms of any problem that we face in the world, these are unbelievably valuable tools. I mean, how does energy work? How does work get done? How do we shape movement? So there's axial rotation, spinning on its axis. There's orbital rotation. And Bucky said, if you do both at the same time, he actually called that dance. If you spin in a circle and orbit the center of the circle, that's dance. That's real dance. That's more complex dance. So when you really realize that this stuff, everything's around us is moving, and Bucky really did believe that, there are no solids, that this is all energy events. And there's work and there are functions and there are, and he even says, I am a function, which is another word almost for verb. But so you have those two, then you have expansion and contraction. And this is unbelievably valuable to see this around you. I mean, the expansion is when you're attracted to something. I said the actor or a character is attracted to someone. They open up, they expand, this Tai Chi move of reaching out your arms to him, almost as if you're going to embrace somebody. They say you can't remain angry when you hold your arms open to embrace somebody. That's expansion. The contraction is the fear of somebody. The neutrality is, do I fight or do I flee or do I embrace, or is this something I can love or is this something I have to hate? And that pause, that stillness where you inhibit action is really the interesting moment. in theater and in life, where, it's not a knee-jerk conditioned response. You sort of go, okay, pause, unplug, what's really going on? And it's not always the brain that figures out. Sometimes the body will figure it out before the brain does, or the intuition. But everything expands and contracts. The oceans, move towards the shore, they move away. We breathe in, we breathe out. We are expanding and contracting, every moment of our life, unless we're frozen in fear and we stop breathing. Even then, there's a kind of counter contraction, counter expansion sort of going on. And the body can get really messed up by that inability to relax and absorb what's going on. Now, toric is, the twisting of something. So I'm sitting here and facing the screen, but I turn here to reach behind me or to look behind me. We all experience toric when we don't like the blind spots in our car and we have to find out if there are cars in that lane. We're torquing. We're facing this way because car is moving very quickly in one direction, but we have to torque around and twist, and that sort of wringing of water out of something. That's an interesting principle. Inside out is fascinating. I mean, this one, like expansion and contraction, which is somewhat connected to inside and out, because you're taking the breath in, you're sending the breath out. And the Tibetan Buddhists are really interesting on this expansion, contraction, taking the breath in. In America, we tend to go, breathe in the good air, breathe out the bad air. Well, we're actually polluting our environment by breathing out the bad air, right? But if you're a Tibetan Buddhist, you breathe in the bad air and you breathe out good air. So you're kind of a filter for the energy. And the Tibetan, they call it Tonglen meditation, or the Lajong, and based on slogans and various things. But what are you doing? Are you taking all the good things and letting out all the bad things, or are you absorbing the bad things? Like one of the Tibetan slogans is, eat the blame. Eat the blame, take it in, and then send out, compassion or something else. So the inside outside, but it's also on a very physical level. Kids like crawling into boxes, like cats like crawling into boxes, like dogs like being inside the house. But when they're inside the house, they want to be outside the house. And when they're outside the house, they want to be inside the house. And they're always at the door trying to get through. And porches are very interesting to me because that's the place between inside and outside. And what's safe to let inside, what's safe to let outside. How does a theater welcome people? I hate the automated phone systems now because people have to go through, Kaiser's a terrible example. Their phone system, like something on my medicine said, if you have this symptom, call your doctor immediately. It's impossible to call your doctor immediately within the Kaiser system. And they're really good doctors, but the phone system is just trash. It's an obstacle course. It actually keeps you out from bothering your doctor. But how does a theater welcome an audience? How does a theater welcome artists? How does a theater toss out somebody who's disruptive of the show? Or how do they absorb them into the show? A heckler, how do they dominate the heckler and bring him into the show? So the inside out is really, but it's also like a right-hand glove. You turn it inside out, it becomes a left-hand glove. You turn that inside out, it becomes a right-hand glove. So that's that sort of, jumping out of yourself. Peer Gynt in the Madhouse, he actually has one character or several characters who really are in a way turning themselves inside out. So their raw inner feelings are on the outside and their shell is on the inside, and they've turned themselves inside out. It's a fascinating principle. Now, precession, which Joe mentioned, is really, very complex in terms of it's a lot about the spin of a gyroscope and that wobble in an orbit, that it's not a strict thing that it wobbles. And that's, I can't go to understanding all the complexities of that, but if you hit the top of a gyroscope, it moves to the right. It doesn't do what you think it's going to do, or it moves to, it moves the right angles to the force that you're doing that. And so many problems we try to attack, they spin out of control. And so we're not really taking in how axial rotation creates a force that when you when you hit it, it moves unpredictably in a different direction. But Bucky also said this is the 90-degree angle side effects that your intention, the vector of your goal, and this is, I guess, in a way what David's talking about too, is how do you deal with something more complex than action counteraction? That does, in my mind, get a little boring. And some of that comes out in the choral responses or the different things that happen. And in fact, there's a man named Francis Ferguson who edited a really good version of the Poetics, but he also wrote a book called The Idea of the Theater. And Francis Ferguson actually was close friends with J. Robert Oppenheimer. He's a really interesting man. He wrote a lot about Dante, and he was a poet and a writer. And he's the one where I got the Kenneth Burke purpose, passion, perception. He's the one who, I thought it was his idea, and then I went back and no, he quotes Kenneth Burke and gets it from Kenneth Burke. This is where I heard from it. What's interesting about this book, The Idea of the Theater, and it starts with Oedipus, and it goes through all these, the whole history of playwrights, and Hamlet, but he says modern theater doesn't have the totality comprehensive vision of Greek theater. It's like you might get a playwright like Chekhov, who in a way is, all the characters are chorus. There is no lead actor who really dominates the action of the play. They may think they do, but it's really the family that absorbs the shock. It's the chorus that absorbs the shock. So that's a really good point. Some plays really are about the choral response. I did a wonderful play called Lady House Blues, and it's about a mother in 1919. They're waiting for their son to come back from World War I. And you think the mother's a dominating figure, but then at the end of Act One, she gives a prayer, and it made me rethink the whole play. She knows that all of her daughters are going to leap out. And it's a very Greek play. I mean, they all sing songs. They sing jazz songs. They sing old folk songs. They really a family that came from the Ozarks, but they're living in St. Louis, and they're waiting for their veteran son to return from warfare. And before he gets home, they find out he died of the pandemic, of the flu. And then that ripples through the family in the second act, and whether to accept the money or not accept the money that the government, because they have very, very interesting play, but it's like, but at the end of the Act One, you realize this is not a domineering mother. She knows all of her daughters are going to fly the coop. One is going to probably die. The other one is going to run away with somebody. The other one's going to have a professional life, and the other one isn't sure what she's going to do. But they're all in motion. They're all, and it really is sort of very much what happened in the 20th century, where people were raised in the mountains, they moved to the city, and then they're just going to keep moving. You know, the diaspora of the family is going to keep fragmenting. And so that's, in a way, the family, the chorus is going to be shattered by the modern world. And it's a really beautiful play called Lady House Blues, and there's street singers that come into it, and then the daughters sing beautiful songs, and it all takes place in a kitchen. But precession is interesting because he says the bee is going to get the nectar. It's unaware that it's dropping pollen at 90-degree angles and fertilizing flowers with the pollen it's collecting. It doesn't know that. It's doing it. It's having this 90-degree angle side effect that's not its main purpose. And the nature of evolution is that we have very intricate interreactions there. A boat goes into a harbor, a big ship, and it sets off waves that toss other boats into total chaos. The ship tosses the boats into chaos. The ship may or may not be aware of the chaos it's creating in the ecosystems and in the, in the shore, the plants and animals that live on the shore may be being wiped out by the big waves of a battleship going in. You know, you watch these, the sailors become very aware in San Diego Bay, the few times I've been sailing with people, of those big ships and what they can do to the little ships. In fact, it's a collision that starts the whole action of Jack London's The Sea Wolf in a fog where two ships collide, and the hero's off on an adventure with this strange captain. So the precession is that, I keep trying to figure this out more, the mathematics and the geometry and the real physics of this, because I understand if you're trying to solve one problem, you might be creating 5 more. That I understand very much. But the other nature of the wobble of every orbit, that we think things are perfect, and they're not, they wobble. Things wobble. And that's where a lot of unpredictability comes in, that people, and that's where theater becomes interesting. You know, I mean, how many tropes of the scientists are going to do the right thing and they never do in the movies? You know, they always manage to mess something up. The fear of science, you know, came out in the Mary Shelley readings we were doing. So they're all aiming at doing one thing, but they're not creating anything beautiful. So the way these interact, you can apply these at any moment in your life, and you can go, okay, who's orbiting who? Who's spinning in circles? Who's spinning and orbiting? I mean, and how does this stuff move? And countries, I mean, when a big ship like the US goes into Iraq, I don't think it ever calculates the ripples that go on in a society when a military force that big enters a country. Or in fact, there was one article about the Ukraine recently that was interesting. It's like, when superpowers collide, it's never good for democracy. It empowers the most dangerous forces in both societies, you know, when there is a collision between superpowers. And those people are, well, they're there to save democracy. They're there to get rid of Nazism, but they, in a strange way, endanger democracy and empower Nazism. I mean, so we have to be very careful with, we maybe think we're doing the right thing, but I don't know, there's no easy answer to that. Let me go a little further and see what we have. Oh, this is interesting. I have to go out of this. This is the best example I have of orbiting and axial rotation, orbital rotation. Of course, it's not a perfect circle, it's an ellipse, but that's a clip I found. But now I'm not sure how I
So
get
Doug,
back.
are you, can you double click on it and see what happens?
Double click on what? Did
You had the clip? No, we couldn't see anything.
Oh, you couldn't? Oh, maybe it won't play. Maybe I can find the link and add it later.
That's fine. That's fine. Please go ahead. Yep.
Let me go back. It's a movie, and I'm not sure how to play a movie.
Okay.
It was on my screen, but it wasn't the one that was shared. So let me move on for now.
Sure.
So points, I mentioned that, you know, the marshmallow, the lines, the angle.
Could you go ahead and play the PowerPoint so we can see the whole screen? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Points, lanes, angles, frequency changes. Frequency changes are the rhythms, the speed of something. And the thing about change and speed and responsiveness, and really good actors, when two great actors are working together, the speed with which and the intuition with which they respond to each other is so remarkable. There are things that happen on stage that are really uncanny. You know, I mean, there was a point where Joe Spano was playing Bucky in Ventura, and I said, this is the point where Bucky dies. And it's where he speculates, are my wife and I going to die at the same time? Maybe so. And he actually said this in front of an audience about 6 days before he died. He speculated that they were going to die at the same time. And they died within 32 hours of each other. And Joe could, take his energy and go inward with it. And somebody came up to me after one of the shows and said, is that the point where Bucky dies? Because there's another epilogue where he's talking about his boat, the last boat he ever bought, called Intuition, and why he named it Intuition, and that intuition was the thing that said, this is something important to pay attention to, that was something, you know, as you're floating the surface of conscious, unconscious life, intuition, something bounces out and says, pay attention to this is important. And so the final section of going back to sea was like Tennyson's Ulysses, that Ulysses is going back to sea. But in my mind, he was already dead at that point. And the way Joe Spano played it at one point, he took his energy, and he was also in Apollo 13 in that mission control room. And when he played the role, he went in and he just kind of disappeared. And so you really kind of felt like he had passed away. And then boom, he was resurrected and he was off on his next adventure. Now, great actors, athletes can turn on a dime. I mean, if you watch this Super Bowl thing, the whole game kept turning on a dime. It kept like just going and turning and flipping. So this there are other things to share, and I may go through them very quickly. This is Václav Havel, who was a playwright who became the president of his country after the Soviet Union fell. As soon as we begin to realize one thing may follow another sequence, some things may be repeated, repetition, different occurrences may be connected, that space, time, and the world are structured, we begin to experience a sense of the dramatic. As soon as we begin to use ritual to communicate with the forces we believe responsible for the order of the world, we're doing theater. This is Václav Havel, who was a resistor to the Soviet regime and then became president of his country. So this is an interesting quote. Here's another dance. It's a spiral. It's not a circle dance, it's a spiral. And this is the Worli tribes, which I'd never heard of until I just was looking up imagery. And so this stuff, the spirals, you'll see the spirals at Newgrange, the Neolithic mounds in Ireland. You'll see them all over the world, in the petroglyphs in the Eastern Sierras. The spiral just pops up everywhere, much like the dot in the middle of the sun. This is a structure that my teacher at Cal Arts had, and he said, when you're building a story or a script, once upon a time, it's like a fairy tale. Once upon a time suggests a dramatic environment. There was a little girl or a little boy or old man. He's the protagonist who had to do something. He has to do something, but there's a conflict, there's an antagonist or a situation that creates a dramatic tension. So what happened was, and then the narrative begins and the plot develops, the wrestling through the purpose and the extension of that purpose and the obstacles that come to that until there's a crisis. This is often called the obligatory scene, where the audience knows it's not going to go the way they think. And then suddenly, to everybody's surprise, there is a peripety, a turning, a surprise throw in the wrestling match. Wham, somebody hits the mat. And forever after, there's some resolution. They live happily ever after, where they're all dead, like at the end of Hamlet. Now, this geometry I wanted to share on Hamlet, that's something else, and it's important, but I don't know if we have time to go in. I taught a Shakespeare class at UC Santa Cruz about 10 years ago. On the final, I gave them a certain number of toothpicks, and I gave them a certain number of marshmallows, and I said, build a structure. And once they built a structure, one of the guys immediately built this, which is like a Ferris wheel, a pinwheel, and he began spinning it. I mean, he instantly built this. And then I said, okay, take that structure. I don't know if I handed out the paper before or after. I can't remember how I structured it, but they built this. And then they had to think of one of the plays they studied and write about it, illuminated by this structure that they built. And I got the best writing I'd gotten all quarter long, because they were actually looking at a physical model of, then they projected a play into that model, and then they wrote about the play. And this one, the guy who built this structure, I think there are a couple of structures like this, but one of the guys built this structure, which is triangles around a center. So there's a center point. There's this in the middle, which is, oh, I'm losing my toothpicks. This is in the middle. It's like the axial. And so the guy said, one of them is Hamlet. One of them is his uncle who killed his father, that he knows he has to take down. In his guts, he knows this. And later, people come and tell him, and a ghost tells him that, but he doesn't trust the ghost. And these are the other main characters of the family: Polonius, Laertes' son, Ophelia, Gertrude, Claudius's wife, Hamlet's mother, and Horatio, the main characters. The other characters are really pretty extraneous, and they all spin around the axis of the struggle between Hamlet and Claudius. And it was a brilliant sort of thing about the energy that all these people are kept spinning by these two people. And I actually played Claudius in the production where this wonderful actor played Hamlet. And I don't think I've played a scarier role in my life, because like a doppelganger, I knew Hamlet was out there and that my nemesis was going to take me down. I had never played a role that felt like such a paranoid world. And that spin between Hamlet and Claudius, the guy who kills his brother and marries his brother's wife, and a total perversion of a whole range of teachings, and the son who becomes a sacrifice and knows that something's out of joint, and curse its bite that I am born to set it right, that he has to set it right. So he is a classic sacrificial victim. And in the end, he feels oddly calm at the end. One of the most beautiful speeches in Shakespeare is the calm that Hamlet feels before the sword fight scene, the kind of odd sort of calm. Now, the intensity of poetry is exhausting. And so this is the quote from Edgar Allan Poe in The Poetic Principle. A long poem does not exist. A long poem is simply a flat contradiction in terms, because a poem is of such intensity, you can't live with that intensity for a long time. So you have to be able to read a poem in an evening. You have to be able to read it in one sitting. Otherwise, you get completely exhausted. So what appears to be a long poem is a collection of small poems. And I wrote the Bucky play as a collection of different poems. It's about 100 different poems. A poem excites the soul. Excitements are transient, cannot be sustained. Great works are a series of minor poems. Read a great work at a single sitting, a constant alteration of excitement and depression. It's exhausting to read a great work. I think we've all felt that, you go so far into the devils and the possessed, and you just got to take a break. I mean, Dostoevsky, I have nightmares when I read Dostoevsky or Shakespeare or Dickens. Some of these writers will infect your subconscious life. And this is something else with Christmas Carol. I discovered there are 5 stages to the mystical journey: the frozen man, melted by tears, reformed by some teaching, tempered by fire, which is often a fear unto death and a dark night of the soul, and then ecstasy. Now, when I found this little article in the Columbia Desktop Encyclopedia that talked about the mystical journey, it was an article on mysticism. It talked about these 5 stages. And I'd been working on Christmas Carol for years, and Christmas Carol, Scrooge is the frozen man. He's mechanistic, he's robotic. He's melted by tears, the death of his little sister. And when he's taken by to his past, he's melted into a puddle of tears by being reminded of his sister who died and the loss of that feminine element in his life and why he's never pursued love. Then he's reformed by teaching. The ghost of present teaches him his precepts, which is to care about other people, but also to celebrate, to party. He's a kind of party god. He's a Mars warrior god, but his sword, he has no sword. His scabbard is empty and rusted, and he is now a god of fertility and plenty. This war god is now transformed into a god of fertility and plenty. And then the future, he sees this terrifying vision of the future, and that forces him to remember these new lessons he's learned and to hide and to hold the shape of the new man. And once he wakes up, and what's interesting here is he keeps asking the ghost of future, the death ghost, questions. Is it too late? I mean, tell me it's not too late. I mean, can I mend this, or can I do something? And he keeps asking questions, and then he suddenly starts making promises. I will honor Christmas in my heart. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. I will not forget the lessons that they teach. He starts making promises, and the ghost disappears. As soon as he actually exerts his will and starts to promise the ghost something, the ghost disappears. And then he wakes up in a state of ecstasy. He can't believe he's alive. And the whole last part of the play is this sort of ecstasy. Well, in the final rewrite, I was driving through the country with my wife at the time, Darla, and we were reading one act I read one act to her, she read the second act to me, and then we were talking and realized that the whole thrust of the Bucky play was about love. And in my final rewrite, I restructured the play to coincide with the structure of Christmas Carol. So in the beginning, Bucky's very robotic. He's stiff, he doesn't move much. He moves down towards the audience, away, to the right, to the left, but not at angles, not many curves. And then in a few scenes, he starts to loosen up. But when his daughter dies, when Alexander dies, he's destroyed. And then he's really destroyed when the second daughter is going to be born. And then he thinks, I'm going to ruin the second daughter the way I did the first daughter. She's going to die, and I better get myself out of the way. And he becomes suicidal. And then he says, wait. And then he has this vision that says, you are not you. You can't get rid of yourself. You belong to the universe. And then he goes through a period of relearning everything he knows. So like the Ghost of Christmas Present, he says, where am I? I'm a failure in business. He has a whole list of things, but he reassesses who he is and what he can do and what he can't do, and goes into solitude and relearns. It's like a reevaluation of all values, like what Nietzsche would say, or different people. And then the play goes into the grunge section where he's talking about the Wall Street lawyers, and he talks about Hiroshima, and he talks about the sort of real destructive forces of the world, and that, we can make it, we may make it, we may not. But there's a very dark sort of implication of, he talks about capitalism's invisible army, which is named for the CIA. And then he goes into this very dark section. And then I began to move things around in the play, like Alexandra's death. And then he gives a speech about the tree's log, and the burning log in the fire is like the sun unwinding from the tree's log. So when Scrooge opens the window, it's Christmas morning, it's bright light, sunlight on snow. It's just gloriously bright. And he has this hit of ecstasy. And then when Bucky comes out of that and says grunge could actually solve this problem, that the corporate leaders, if they just re-aim it, can really solve a lot of these problems. Then the sun kind of comes out, and he talks about the sun's energy unwinding from the tree's log. That's what fire is. And then he goes into a series of almost ecstatic poems before the end of the play, much like Scrooge does. So that's the structure. This is how you can sometimes find a structure and do a very different story, but the structure is valuable. The geometry of it is valuable. This 5-beat geometry of past, present, future. Now this is Joe Spano, played the role in Ventura, with the demonstration of 1 + 1 = 4. One triangle plus one triangle gives you 4 triangles on the tetrahedron. This is a giant vector equilibrium we did. I may or may not do this in this lecture room environment, but that's the jitterbug transformation, and the actor goes into the middle of it. And this is the beautiful kind of ladder back chair, which he is sitting in one of those in a Unitarian church in New England, and we stole it out of a documentary movie. This is when he talks about Hiroshima and the devastation that Einstein felt when he realized his greatest realization brought such massive destruction, and that the rest of his life was kind of blighted. Is the Montreal Dome, which Bucky says became a realization of a side effect of the love he had for his wife, and he compares it to the Taj Mahal as a building of beauty that was built for the builder's wife, the love of the builder for his wife. And so that's that moment. and then the universe. It sort of goes into sort of various ecstatic things. Now, these are things I saw at Mount Auburn where Bucky's buried, okay, which are, love inscribings on trees. So, but then here's at Mount Auburn in Cambridge is Longfellow's tomb, or whatever it is, monolith. This is Bucky's doing more with less, I think. This is the stone for he and his wife that's at Mount Auburn. This is my brother, who passed away about 12, 13 years ago, but actually dragged me to the Bucky lectures. And when I was a high school student, I graduated and went to work as a waiter in Washington, D.C. with my brother, and we spent every weekend in the National Gallery of Art. And this was at one of the main entrances, Salvador Dali's The Last Supper. And we would always go in and stare at this because he was outside of the Mormon church and I was a year away from leaving the Mormon church. But this seemed to be powerful for both of us. It's Salvador Dali's The Last Supper. And this is a close-up of it. And then when I was developing and writing the play, I found this image of a boat floating. The plays have to float on water as boats have to float on water, and they have to carry a cargo. And the boat has to be for entertainment or it has to carry serious cargo. So the idea of the playwright is built like shipwright. And so I think the building of a play is a lot like building a boat. It has to float. Actors have to want to step into it. And so they're and dramaturg actually comes from a similar thing like playwright. Turg actually, that sort of working of something into shape. There's sort of a craft. There is a geometry to writing plays, but it's not predictable. It's not, Hollywood movies are all built on a very predictable pattern. And Alexander McKendrick said, you have to write from life and you may end up in a pattern, but if you start with the pattern, it's like starting with the emotion. It's fake, it's not there. It has to be organic. Here's his book, Alexander McKendrick's on Filmmaking, An Introduction to the Craft of the Director. Martin Scorsese wrote the foreword, a British man edited it. And then some interesting things on Dickens and mesmerism. Turns out mesmerism had a big influence on Freud, and it was going back into the past to reorganize it in the present so you can move to the future with a fresh energy. And so Mesmer, who was really very strange phenomenon at the time, it became hypnotism because mesmerism sort of became discredited. But then Freud eventually turned away from hypnotism and then went to free association and other things. But it's a very interesting thing. And this is other stuff about how to write a play, and maybe we'll go into that, but I won't go into that right now. Let me stop sharing this, and I'll share one other picture. Here's a collection of masks, which are a lot of different feelings, and there's only one here that's kind of calm. The rest of them are freaked out or happy or strange or all those things that knock you off center. But I think it's a wonderful kind of variation of masks. And the idea that I just learned that the Greeks actually would take these off at the end of a performance and put them at the altar of Dionysus, which is the ultimate change. Dionysus is torn apart and then he's reassembled like Osiris or like Christ is resurrected, destroyed, but sort of returns again. So I find these range of masks, I stumbled on this last night, very interesting. So that's kind of what I have to share here. If there are other questions or
wonderful, thank you, amazing, thank you, Doug. So folks, now it's time for any comments, any questions. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark to either give comments or ask questions. Doug, you're okay spending a few minutes now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, give me just a second here. Hold on. Okay, next up is going to be Mark. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Doug. We met last year. Hi.
Hi,
Nice to
good to
see
see
you. What a joy. I can just say I saw the play in San Diego, gosh, how many years? 5 years ago or so. And if, for folks who haven't seen it, it's a phenomenal piece of work. Knowing some of Bucky and what he was about, it was a whole nother perspective to see it performed as such. But to go through what we just got to experience of your journey for structuring it is a whole nother level of perspective into the creation of that play particularly. But what my question for you is okay, so this is all very interesting, and how story and structure of theater and communicating our stories. What's happening to theater? How valuable is this, or how do we apply it? Because I don't see theater happening the way it used to, or where is that happening?
Well, that's a really good question, and there's no easy answer. When COVID started, it reminded me of the Puritans who closed the Elizabethan Jacobean theaters in the 17th century. And they remained closed for about 20 years, and they were closed as health and moral hazards. And I think we're in a time where in the 60s, we all went into the theater to create as dangerous a play as we could. And then we figured, well, we shouldn't do that. We might kill ourselves or somebody else. But I mean, it wasn't really about creating a safe place. Not that the abuses that were in theater, that those were addressed, and all of that got softened, not addressed enough in many cases. And so there's a lot of work to do on that front. But theater has always been an outside, except during the Greek period or the Roman period, was at the center of the health and of the soul of the city. The theater, I think, played a role in the soul of the city. And I can't tell you how many times people will be in a rehearsal and will go, "This is not rocket science." And I'm going, no, it's harder than rocket science. It's like, you think this is going to be fun, or people will come, you go home and say, "Oh, I'm doing theater," and people go, "Oh, that must be fun." And it's like, well, yeah, when it's not breaking your heart and destroying you, it's a lot of fun. I mean, because the actor has desires that it's not going to fulfill, and so the actor has to almost slaughter his own desires so the character can live. I mean, it's a weird sort of ritual sacrifice that the actor has to make and set aside his own needs so the actor's needs can come alive. And the difference, I'll tell you, in an audition room between an actor coming into a director and going, "I need a job, give me a job, I want a job," and somebody who can take you to the South, and in Tennessee Williams' character can take you to Russia or Czechoslovakia or London or some fairy tale land. An actor who can actually carry a director out of the audition room into another reality. He may or may not get cast, but it's a blessing on every director who's somebody who can make an imaginary realm alive in a room. I mean, there are certain things about theater that are brutal, particularly in this country. This country does not respect actors. I've known Black actors who of course, don't like the N-word, but then they realize, well, every actor is treated that way. They're all field workers. They're all migrant workers. Nobody gives them a full-time job. Nobody hires them to be part of a company. That's what I spent 20 years of my life trying to do, create a company that gave a home for actors. There was a big project about the artist's home, how to make a home for artists. But we're a Puritan culture. We don't do that to artists unless they're rich and famous, and then we worship them, but not generally. There's no poverty with honor for artists in this country. It is, if you go to even a junior high school or a elementary school and you talk to kids and say, "I'm an actor," and say, "What movie did you do?" I mean, it's like the reduction of what the artist's job is really remarkable. And kids, I mean, you expect that from kids, but adults do the same thing. You know, you go home and like, oh, you're in theater. Oh, recite something for us. It's like, and when the preparation of a role, they say that an actor playing a role like Hamlet puts out the same energy as an NBA basketball player. But there are no live theater performers who are paid like NBA basketball players.
Doug, I want to ask, I mean, this is such a fantastic question. I want to ask a follow-up question here.
So I don't know when theater is going to come back. Just to finish that answer, I think it's going to be another 5 or 10 years before theater returns. And I'm not sure it's always been a commercial theater in this country. I had a teacher who taught the history of American theater. It's a commercial theater. Eugene O'Neill and a lot of people have tried to do the European art theaters and layer it onto American culture. But if it's not a commercial success, which was what was surprising about the Bucky play, it became a commercial success for a few years in a commercial production in San Francisco for 15 months. But so the idea, I mean, just to finish this a little bit, because I think it's such a good question, there's a book called The Playwright as Thinker. In Europe, the top philosophers wrote for the theater. Schiller, Goethe, Lessing, top philosophers wrote for the theater. You try to do that in this country, and people think you're trying to destroy their operation, if you bring ideas in. I mean, my wife was working on a Shakespeare production, and she was working in a good theater and good actors. And she said, well, she was talking about the ideas. She was a coach on it. She was talking about the ideas, and the actors were saying, well, you can't act an idea. And my wife and she's not academically trained, she just turned to them and said, no, you can't if your ideas aren't very strong. But if you have a strong idea, you can act it. It's an imperative. It says you have to go this area. But the American theater is generally terrified of ideas. And American Hollywood is even worse. And a lot of good work slips through. A lot of work happens by accident. A lot of great writers are creating great work. It's not always getting produced. But
go ahead.
But the habits of building a theater where the show must go on, and that leads to certain abuses, but theater is incredibly vulnerable. And if the show doesn't go on, it disappears. Now there's sort of a thing, well, if the conditions aren't perfect, the show must close. Theater is not going to survive that. Churches, theaters, anything that gathers a public, if you have 25% of your audience right now, that's normal. If you have half of your normal audience, you're lucky. Theater cannot survive with half of its normal audience, which never was enough. So theater is really in danger, and it's probably going to go back outdoors into the fields like the Greeks did before the big theaters. It's going to happen with young people who don't know what they're getting into. I mean, I went into the arts to not be a workaholic like my dad, and then I started a theater and became a workaholic exactly like my dad. So but the fabric of that kind of performance thing, it takes centuries to build that sort of vaudevillian skill with comedy, which we've been, you watch there's a great documentary on vaudeville, and it is so funny, and the musical skills are so high, and the dance skills are so high. And a lot of that's sort of a lost art, people who can really do that. And every actor knows tragedy is fun and comedy is a science. I mean, comedy is hard. Comedy is like but those are things that develop over decades and centuries. And so I'm not sure the theater, it will survive. It will come back because people need that herd. Someday we'll be allowed to be mammals again and gather in herds and be comfortable doing it. Maybe.
Wow.
I don't know.
That was amazing question and amazing answer.
No, it's a really good question. I think about it almost every day.
I just want to do a follow-up. When I look at Greeks and the role theater played in their life, it was not entertainment. Like even like theater is kind of regarded as entertainment. It was not entertainment. It was actually the core of what was sustaining those people. And so that audience that was listening, that was experiencing that theatrical performance was a crucial part, and it was moved. It was moved, and it was a, they would not be able to hold that culture without that theater. So that is very, very different kind of theater than what is prevalent here.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Allison, followed by Madeline. Allison.
I don't even know where to go after all that, but I don't have a question. I just really wanted to thank you so much, Doug, because this was just completely fascinating. And I've been kind of struggling with the Bucky stuff because I'm not a math person and I don't really care that much about geometry, but I feel like the way that you are really explaining how it's used in a theater and how it's used to create different effects, and then also connecting it to Aristotle and connecting it to all these different ideas is just absolutely brilliant. And this is like completely fascinating. So I just really want to thank you so much for it.
Thank you. It's good to see so many people here.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. Next up is Madeline. Madeline, thanks for waiting for this question or comment. Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Shrikant, for putting this on. Doug, this has been amazing. I feel so privileged to be here. And I think this entire session serves as a counter argument to the possibility of artificial intelligence ever achieving anything comparable to what human beings can do. I wanted to go back to the idea of the triangle and then also the chorus. Because Evanique had raised the topic of injustice. And I was thinking that the chorus, say in the Goethe group that we've been doing, the chorus speaks for the different characters in the first person or in the third person. In other words, it takes different parts, it comments, it observes, but it doesn't actually do anything. So in that way, it's a stand-in for the audience, except that it's up on stage. And so as the stand-in for the audience, it kind of takes the audience along in inhabiting the interior aspects of the characters, what their morals are, what their motivations are. And so it seems that when you were talking about a field, this could be another way of looking at what's missing right now in our culture.
Yeah, interesting. Well, the field, there was one thing I wanted to bring up. My dad was an attorney, and he was a good attorney, and he would like negotiate contracts so people wouldn't end up in court. Some attorneys like put little traps in contracts where they know they'll end up in court and they can make more money on it. But he came out of the Oakland playgrounds. And so the field of play was really important to my dad. And he could somehow, and a good playground self-regulates in a way. And there are people who can take down the bullies and can empower the underdogs. And my dad had a very high skill at doing that. Not that everybody would agree with everything he did, but he'd often give an opponent a good thing in a contract negotiation, and they wouldn't trust him. They'd think he was pulling a trick on them. And a young lawyer would have to tell the older lawyer, no, this is a good thing. Take it. It's a good thing. It'll help. Because a contract for him and a budget for me is a way to implement a vision. And so I think it's the field of play and what we do with that field, and whether it brings fertility or devastation is, I think, at the heart of the fertility rites. Were really at the heart of Greek tragedy. I mean, how do you renew the culture? And John Gardner was a Republican who worked for Robert Kennedy, and he created Common Cause, and he wrote a book called Self-Renewal. and another book called Excellence. But self-renewal is about how do individuals, how do groups renew themselves? How do they not take things for granted and grow old and create a wasteland around them? How do they keep the fields fertile for play? Thornton Wilder does that in Matchmaker, where he said, money's like manure. It's only good if you spread it around to help young things grow. But that's, not necessarily where money's going right now.
Thank you. Next up is going to be David, followed by Joe. David.
I want to reiterate the thank you for the incredible range of things you presented and what you shared with us. Really get hints of the depth that, of your experience. And you've talked a focus on the dramaturgy, what theater is, okay? And we're getting now to, I think, another aspect, which is why it is, the Aristotelian role of drama for society, or even Adorno, opposite ends of a spectrum, that is drama functioning still to serve society, to advance vision, to take society somewhere. I think it's coming up in what you're talking about, our field of play is what's on stage, our now, and our having revelation, in the theater experience. Do you see that happening? I mean, certainly stories have their power. Fox News is expressing a lot of power to a lot of people and doing things back to society. It's, there's a churning. What do we need in this moment? Is there a generation of new storytellers, or is it the COVID answer? We're just waiting to get back to life again? Thanks.
Well, there's been a lot of waiting, but I think that there are encouraging signs. I mean, theater is a little bit like, if there's an empty space, an actor will find it and fill it and do a show there. I mean, it's like weeds grow in the cracks in the pavement. I mean, the young people who want to be actors, they do find a way to do it, even as the big institutions tend to ossify. There's a great thing called an empty space that Peter Brook, who died recently, but he was trying to find ways that you could speak to the world and move away from language. And so Peter Brook, one of the greatest directors in the world, came to California to study with Luis Valdez and Teatro Campesino in the middle of the fields, back when they were doing plays for the farm workers in the fields, because they're studying clowning. So he came out to study clowning. Helen Mirren, I just found out, was in that company as well, and why she became friends with some of the people in Teatro Campesino. That there are people who are doing this. There are red-nosed clowns that have gone into Syria, into the worst areas, and there are Palestinian and Israeli citizens collaborating on theater in Israel. These stories don't tend to get much focus, but there are people who are using theater. I know an experimental director, playwright, actually, Eric N., A-E-H-N, who ended up going into teaching, and he would take his students, he was talking to his wife and watching the trial at The Hague, or it was going to happen, the trial of the nuns who were involved in the Rwanda genocide at The Hague. And he said and he was Catholic, he was a devout Catholic, an experimental playwright who was a devout Catholic. And he said, someday I'd like to go watch a trial like that. So his wife, smart, said, why not now? Go do it now. So he went to the trial, made friends with a man from Rwanda. And after that, he began to take his students on trips to Rwanda, to Auschwitz, to all these places where horrible genocides had happened. And what he found is the men had destroyed each other. So the women had to rebuild the culture, and arts were a big part of rebuilding culture in some of these towns. But that's other countries. And I think I've read various things that cultures, when they're in terrible prisons, the ones that have habits of not getting their stories from media, but through family storytelling, often survive better under horrible conditions because they know how to tell stories to each other. than people who have been sort of distanced from those, let's gather around the fire and tell a story, or let's gather around a loaf of bread and tell stories. Let's do whatever we have. And so it's going to survive, but you know, the way the theaters had been developing over the last 100 years, they've been thrown a curveball. And so, but there are some interesting signs. I mean, what's the other one? There's some, well, I mentioned the Palestinian Israel, these
Doug, can I remember what you're saying? I mean, there are a lot of voices now that have to be heard. There's L, there's G, there's B, there's T, there's Q, there's I, there are more letters though. There's women, there's race, there's class. You know, there are a lot of histories to be told. But there was something about the Greek theater, was it because they were all the same ethnic group? They sat together and they all shared that message. And that did something. How can we do that if we have so many separate letters right now?
Well, I think ultimately there may be as many sexualities, there may be 8 billion variations of sexuality on the planet. And so the more we get to trusting the individual to define who they are rather than, it's an interesting thing to me. I think the falling back on categories is a very particular American, British, even Germanic need to have categories and pin people down to them. And I do think that in the long run, there's sort of an absurdity to that, even as it serves some purpose. But one of the other experimental playwrights I know was skeptical of some of the identity politics because it would make people, and this was in the 1980s, it would make people worry about what their group was getting rather than seeing the people at the top are robbing all of us. You know, that it would make us blind to seeing the lack of integrity and even what Tennessee Williams called mendacity at the top that is destroying everybody. But we're all wondering whether our group is getting what it needs to get. So the Greeks actually, in Athens actually, and this is in the Oedipus play, is not a xenophobic one race. Some of the great philosophers and writers came from Macedonia or somewhere else or some other place. If you were willing to come and say, okay, I'm an Athenian and I'll buy into, and it didn't fully work. I mean, it was about a 100-year experiment and then it went in another direction, but it was, I think Bucky actually trusts the individual to make natural alliances and to do things. I think Bucky is really one of the great theorists of democracy, in that it's based on the individual and based on individual impulses to align and not, well, I have to align myself here because that's what I have to do because my parents are aligned there or my teachers tell me I'm aligned there. I mean, he trusts the individual intuition, and that is the challenge. And I think ultimately, you know, when all those letters become 8 billion letters, then maybe we'll get close to the truth.
I just wanted to hear your optimism when there's a universal message that we can all go to the same play and like revel. That's, you know, together.
Well, yeah, no, and I think it'll happen maybe outdoors. I keep thinking, you know, if there's an empty field, you know, let's do a play, or there's a street corner, do a play. But I don't know that I'm optimistic. As Bucky said, I'm not a pessimist or an optimist. I'm a very hard realist. I mean, he knew we were on a razor's edge between utopia and oblivion, and that it's not a, I love theater, so I get optimistic when I talk about it, but I'm not particularly optimistic, you know, when I look at, although globally, I think some things are coming into place that, but in this country, I think the arc of history bends towards money. It's like a gravitational force field that is not, but I think globally, it probably bends towards justice, but I'm not sure. We've neutralized that here in certain ways. And so I, you know, you get me in another mood and I'll be,
Okay.
but I love theater. I mean, I think that gathering I tell people, I mean, I don't have a lot of hope in a lot of areas, but if I can gather a few friends and have a good meal, I mean, that's a good thing. That's something we can do for each other, you know. So my goals are very small in a way, you know.
Absolutely. Doug, I'm a big fan of gathering few people here like this and doing, you know, and putting these kind of things on the table for everybody, because I think it is life-giving for everybody.
I'm so happy to see so many names that have been so many journeys through Dante and Dostoevsky
Yes.
and Gita. And I mean,
Yes.
it's really, this is a kind of interesting Evanique and people I never knew before coming here. It's a
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, Richard, and Allison. Joe.
Yeah, this has been fantastic, Doug. And I mean, and I'm grateful for you doing this. And it has opened up my eyes, you know, on a number of levels, just how the geometry of thought fits into actually plays. That's interesting. But I really found it interesting that I'll admit I didn't really understand what dramaturgy was up until this meetup. And so understanding that and the way you linked it specifically to the lines, points, and angles and changes slide, you know, it's interesting because I think that plays and dramaturgy does this, has a way of introducing ideas that change the culture. And so that if you think of it in terms of how in geometry and the way you were pointing out in that slide, or even in ideas of precession, of how change occurs, that the world's constantly in flux, that you can kind of see a connection between these two, that they both can serve as catalysts for moving a culture one way or the other, not necessarily always in a positive direction, but that to me was, you know, kind of eye-opening. And I very much appreciated the Hamlet example, where you used how Claudius and Hamlet and how everybody's interacting around them in a structural format. That was fascinating as well, because it's a way of actually kind of understanding a complex play, even that in a visual way, in a visual format, using visual structures. And I think that that's what we've been kind of gaining here. And I also appreciated Richard's question earlier. So no real question other than, you know, that maybe if you see there are links between dramaturgy and geometry, or am I just envisioning, you know, maybe am I stretching that a little bit too much?
no. I think that, and even this is a work in progress, but I realized I got to that page and it was a little bit of one of the last slides I put in. And I said, well, I mentioned this in the description, I got to describe it. And then I realized, one of the things my dad taught me was, you know, in basketball, it was like a religion in our family. The feint, you look like you're heading in this direction, but you're going in that direction. And great plays do that you think they're going here and boom, they go that way. You think this is going to happen and then that happens. I don't know, does that answer your question?
It does. It absolutely does. Yeah.
I realize that is really important. I mean, I know that. I've talked to actors about vectors, and you're going here. You may not get there. You'll never get there in this play, but that's where you're going at.
Right.
You know, George and Lenny are going for that farm where he can pet the rabbits and he can create this promised land of everything that's good, and they never get there. But the longing for the promised land has to be the main drive of that. And oddly, he wrote A Vice Men to teach himself how to write a play. It is a perfect play. The novella is actually a play, and with an expressionistic ending where the rabbit comes and attacks him at the end, you know, in a voice that torments him. But it's so the life, the space, and actually, you mentioned this, but a great director, unfortunately, soon after he did this to a class of mine, he started teaching at UCSD when I was teaching there once. And Alan Schneider, great New York director out of Russia. He got killed by a freak accident in London because he didn't look the right direction when he crossed the street and got hit by a motorcycle. But he he would go through a directing class and ask people, what's the medium of the director? And everybody would say, oh, actors or this or that, and he'd say, and eventually it would be changing relationships in space and time. You know, like a sculptor works in stone or in clay, but a director works in changing relationships in space and time. And so when you think of the job of the director that way, how you take the space of whatever theater you're working in, whether it's outdoors or indoors, whether it's huge or whether it's small, and you fill that space with changing relationships in space and time. And so the vectors and the angles and the frequency change is very interesting, the speed, and it can work to your detriment. I was watching the last of the Bourne movies that I'll probably ever watch, and there is a heartbeat rhythm that audiences will almost entrain to. If an actor breathes and is relaxed and their heart is going 60 beats a minute, it's very calming. It's a very slow heartbeat. It's the Largo music and Baroque movements, and it's about 60 beats a minute. But I counted the score, and almost nonstop through the movie, to the point where it just got ridiculous. The Bourne score was going like, you know, 1,000, 2 1,000, 1,000, 2 1,000. It was going like 240 beats a minute. It was beating the audience into adrenaline. I mean, through a score that never let up. It almost constantly was just going, you know, it was just like crazy. And it's like, and it doesn't change. I mean, that's not theater. I mean, if anything gets into one vein and stays there, it's not alive. Some mechanism, you know, to beat you into submission.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Next up is going to be Richard, Allison, and Kevin. Richard.
Yeah, thank you again, Doug. I've a number of things are running through my mind. One is that we're approaching the 40th anniversary of Bucky's death in July. Secondly, when I think of your play, the one-man play, I'm also thinking that Bucky was sort of a one-man play in the latter part of his life and traveling all around the world. The play lasted a relatively long period of time, but it's not out there yet, the way it kind of was. And so it makes me wonder whether or not a reincarnation of Bucky through a one-person play is a possibility, and is it a way of carrying on his thinking and his messaging that people start, even if they don't fully understand what his words are all about, they get the message, the feeling. And then the other kind of tie into that has to do with, I spent 6 months in India back in the mid-90s, and I watched street plays where people were trying to get across a social message or a justice message, or clean up the playground message that was being used as an open toilet system. So I wonder your thoughts about a one-man play, one-person play becoming kind of like the reincarnation of Fuller, and whether the medium of a street play has potential in terms of bringing it to the people in the streets of our communities.
Yes, street plays can be very powerful. And there's a guy named Augusto Boal, B-O-A-L, who's from Brazil or Argentina. And he would do these weird, like, plays in restaurants, and people didn't know they were plays, but they were kind of politically driven events, you know, where you would see how crowds would react. So that's a very powerful way of doing it. The play itself, I don't know if you came in late. It looks like I'm negotiating with a theater in LA, a small theater, to present the play, to act it myself in LA at the end of this year, which I have done the play before at SIU Carbondale. and at SIU Edwardsville in the dome that Bucky designed. And then I did 24, between those two performances, I did 24 performances at the back end of a yoga studio in my neighborhood. Pretty much like I saw Bucky at the College of Creative Studies, just walked in and did the play. And so I can walk into a living room and do the play. And probably the first performances I'll do this year will be in a living room somewhere. But I think it's time. I'd be very curious, because every time I do the play, depending on the events in the world, people think I've completely rewritten it, and I haven't. They've just changed what they're hearing in the play. Like, we went to war, shock and awe, when the play was going gangbusters in San Francisco, and then everybody stayed home to watch TV and Bush's invasion of Iraq. But people thought after that war started, I'd completely rewritten the play, and I hadn't. They were just hearing it differently. So I'm very curious how the play will play in the post-COVID period. Because there is a line that always struck me as spooky because of AIDS, where he talks about the icosahedra. He says nature uses it for all the protein shells of all the viruses. That's why they're so strong. And that always struck me as a spooky line, but audiences didn't pick it up. But there's a Wall Street lawyer speech that I patterned in the final rewrite off of Mort Saul's kind of very sharp, biting rants. And it was a very funny speech. After the banks failed in 2008, nobody laughed at that speech anymore. There was not a peep of laughter. I mean, maybe a wry chuckle here or there, but it was not a funny speech anymore. Because Bucky had predicted that 20 years before, 30 years before the events of the bank failures in 2008. So I'll be very curious what the play does, or even if I have a memory to memorize it again. It took me 3 months to learn it the first time I did it, and 2 months to relearn it the second time I did it.
Thank you. Next up is Allison, followed by Kevin. Allison.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you were saying, why is theater suffering right now? And I think, part of it is people's fear of gathering that's still sort of lingering. But I think it's more than that, though. I think it's that the last 3 years have been so many really intense emotions that people don't want that. And theater is a place where you go to feel really intense emotions. And I would bet that that the first plays that are going to be really successful coming out of this are going to be more escapist. And then eventually, as people get more distance from this, then they'll feel more comfortable, feeling things. But I feel like we're in this kind of state of psychic numbing right now, where we're sort of like, we're moving on, but we're not quite right. We're just, emotionally, we're just all not quite right. And I think that, there's just times when, things that are too intense are uncomfortable. So people want something that's safe, and I think that's part of it. The other thing is, I would love to know where you're doing that play this summer, because I'll be out in LA at some point this summer. So
it'll be more in the fall, won't be in the summer. But if I do it here, then it's more likely I will probably get it booked in other places. A man who's worked on the play before has offered to maybe create a space for it in another city. And once you learn, if I learn the play again, it's a 2-hour monologue, and it's every actor who's done it has gone through something of an existential crisis, other than maybe one who was the youngest guy who played it. But when I learned it, I hated the playwright for a while for writing this. But once you learn it, it's like skiing downhill. It's like skiing in the Alps or something. I mean, it's like there's huge energy in. And oddly, the play is very much about my father. I knew it was about them, but I didn't realize how much until I acted in it, how much it was about my father and my mother and my brother the artist, and my mother was into science, math, and my father was the philosopher and the athlete. And he always said a bad athlete, but he loved the game, and good attorney, and always the talker. But yeah, and I am gonna, what Joe's saying, if I relearn it, I have a friend who saw it, who I went to school with, decades ago who's been beating me up that I haven't put it on film yet. So if I get it up again, I will find a way to put it on video tape and then possibly other actors. One of the people that, and I think the more older he gets, the more he looks like Bucky actually, is one of the people, Allegra, we were all trying to think, well, if a famous actor did it, who would it be? And Allegra, his daughter, said, I always thought Tom Hanks would make a good Bucky. And the older he gets, the more he has that sort of dome head. So
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Kevin. Kevin, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Sanka. And Doug, you dramatically changed my mind, bring me back like my mom, just like a small talk, a small stage, watch she already, get excited if you see some drama on the stage. And by the way, I heard from actor aspect, they like small stage. They can touch audience. They know which moment audience is going to excited. They're going to, which moment they can enjoy each other kind of from top stage to the audience. So, and for me, it's from I'm from China, so I share the three. One is like crosstalk. It used to be 20 years ago, almost this only few stage on and not popular. Slowly one guy, it's sort of story. He just insist, I want to do it, doing this. Now it's hard to buy the tickets, line up people. It's in Beijing, in Tianjin, so many cities. So one thing I think, if we can connect audience, they can live with internet, video game, they go to the stage, go to the, watch the show. And second is like picking, about picking opera. About 50 years ago, like rich people, they go into, okay, I like this style. They just pay whole, basic support that actor. So now slowly a little bit job, but people still pick it up again. And last one, third one is good tea party. That's like Shakespeare. It's in China. They play on a stage too. So thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, folks, this was wonderful. Doug, thank you. Thank you so much. This was just incredible presentation. I really look forward to you doing the play. So the three-party, you're going to be the actor, director, and playwright. So you already have the triangle within you, and then you will have the audience, as the chorus interacting, hopefully, with that triangle. So I am, wish you all the best, and I'm really grateful for you, because this was really, really special. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
All right, folks, thank you very much, and we will see you soon. Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Do you